So today I wanted to talk about some of the layer effects that we have within After Effects. I believe in a previous class I showed some of the common ones that I would do all under the effect menu. Uh, all the ones that you have in Photoshop are available here and then some. There's tons and tons of effects within After Effects, as the name would suggest. So many that there's a search bar to the right. So if you can't remember where something is, just remembering the name of the technique is also really helpful. Some of these are really helpful and ones you'll use a lot. Many are very specialized and you might not ever think you'll find a use for it until that one specific project comes along and you'll be like, aha, I know how to do this. So first, just some of the basic ones. Color correction's probably the most useful. We've only been working with static images so far in After Effects, but we're going to be importing video near the end of the semester. So even if you were going to do a longer video that was like edited, I would probably do color correction in Premiere or Final Cut, but you can do basic color correction just within After Effects. So I've got this nice little summer scene here, but if I wanted to kind of change the color or look of this, I could go Effect Color Correction and go to my levels. And then when you add effects, you already know by now that the interface is pretty jam-packed in After Effects. Your project window is where we import things and where we manage our compositions. To the right of that is an effects tab. And sometimes you lose your project window or your effects tab. Just problem solving wise, you know that you can always reset your workspace. I've noticed though that even when you reset Essentials, effects doesn't pop back up, which is really frustrating. So if you're missing the effects panel for some reason, if you go to Window, Effects, and Presets, that actually just opens up this panel. It's a little weird, but you've got to go Window, Workspace, Effects, and then it will open up this panel again. So it's not a palette, it can't be opened from the Window menu. You just have to go to your workspace to open that again. And I did not mean to remove that, so let's just reset one more time. If you haven't played with the different workspaces, there's quite a few. There's one specifically for animation, where you've got like preview and things like that here. You also have motion tracking, which is something we'll be doing near the end of the semester. Basically, it's just different combinations of palettes to the right. I like working in just Essentials. And I lost my effects window again. It just likes to do that, so I'm going to go Window, Workspace, Effects. And what's weird is the only thing that does is bring up the effects palette. It doesn't change the workspace otherwise. So with my effects panel highlighted, you can see I've got a histogram here. Right now I'm affecting R, G, and B, but I can affect each channel individually. And so if I wanted to up the contrast in this, I can see there's quite a bit of black, but I can up that by just dragging this over. And there seems to be no pure white, but I can easily just grab the slider. And if I turn the little effects on and off, you can see the increase in contrast. I increase the contrast using levels in just about everything, whether it's Photoshop or After Effects. Even if it's stock photography, even if you took a really good photo, I think most things can benefit from just a little more contrast, unless you want kind of that gray sheen to it. There's usually gray there that you don't perceive until you remove it. If I want to make this more specialized, I can go to a specific channel, like green, and I could dial the green in or out. So I could remove some of that green if I wanted it to be a little more autumny or something like that. Usually if you mess with one channel, you have to adjust the other ones too. Even though I removed the green, you can see there's way too much blue and purple now. So I'd go to the blue channel and try to kind of dial that in. But I could really change the look of my effect. And why I bring this up for effects is if I wanted this to be a fall scene instead of a summer scene, I could do that with just like a color adjustment. What I would probably do in this situation is mask out the sky and the tree area, just because I don't want those to be so purple. So for something like that, I could actually just copy and paste my effect. When I copy and paste my layer, I mean the effect copies too. I'm going to turn off the top one for a moment. The bottom one I'm actually going to remove levels. And so if I go back to this top one, we just talked about masks the other day. So just in quick review, masks basically change what we can or can't see. They're a way of changing the visibility of something. And even though this would be much better to separate in something like Photoshop, where I can use the masking there to get soft edges, just real quick, if I wanted to punch out the sky in this one thing I could do is on this top one that has the colorization, I'm just going to grab my pen tool with that layer selected, and my tools went away. Let's put those right there. I want to grab my pen tool, and I'm just going to kind of trace along this edge here. And I can click and drag if I want my points. I'm not going to worry too much about this tree. Like I said, if I was doing this in a real project and not just a demo, I would probably clean this up in Photoshop. And it's going to do the opposite because the default of a mask is to add. Okay, so I just need to go to my mask and subtract this instead. And it doesn't blend too well yet, but now we're seeing through this top one to the one behind it, where that effect isn't taking place. So you can kind of work with masks together. And if I don't think this has a very clean edge, which it doesn't, remember you've got all those mask options. Like if I increase the feather a little bit, we can create like a softer, more natural edge. So same thing with the little houses here. If I'm on the top layer, I could punch a hole out of them, so to speak, using my pen tool by just kind of drawing around it. Whenever I use a pen tool, whether I'm in Illustrator, Photoshop, or After Effects, I tend to draw kind of quickly and then fix my paths afterwards. Now with this one, when we have another mask, this one's set to add. We want this one to also be subtract. And then it's just going to punch out and show us our little village. This one doesn't work as well because of the trees. We want as few of those trees in there as possible. And then we probably would feather this as well. Feathering is nice because feathering kind of mimics the effects you have in Photoshop a little bit more. I love masking in Photoshop because you have those soft edges. So this is a little too detailed around the trees, but the nice thing is that then we're getting the tree color difference thanks to the mask. Okay, so we basically have two layers of the same thing. One has an effect, one doesn't. And then the top one just has basically holes punched out of it. So if I turn this on or off, you can see through this area. Okay, so you can use masking. We talked more about it as a revealing technique in the last class, but you can also use it for kind of special effects as well. Remember, masks aren't permanent. You can delete them at any time. I could edit them as well. So if I want to get rid of a mask, I could just delete it by clicking on the mask icon. And I'm going to actually hide this one for now. I just used levels to kind of change the color temperature, and let me see, reset this. I just used that technique to kind of change the color temperature and make it look a little more autumny. Another example of what we could do using kind of common techniques is if we wanted to change color, there's more than levels. Levels are my personal favorite. But we also have under color correction, hue and saturation's another one I use pretty frequently. Oh, well that's cool. My GPU is out of memory. I will ignore that for now. And come back. Actually, I'll just use this as a teaching moment. After Effects takes a lot of RAM. Probably more than any other software you use unless you're doing 3D or video. If you have issues with memory on your machine, just quick side note, if you go to After Effects at the top into Preferences, you can change your media and disk cache. And this, you always want to enable disk cache. It should be on in your machines. How many of you are using your own machines as well? Okay, so this is even more important for you because here it should be set up this way. But disk cache just means you're letting the temporary memory of the computer do some work. Okay, you want to allot as much space as you can possible. If it feels like it gets full or something like that, you can empty the disk cache. LeVar?
Does that computer have 23 gigs of RAM on it?
It should have even more. That's just how much are allotted right here, so I can actually go way up. Depending on it. If you don't know what your computer settings are, if you go to the Apple and choose About This Mac, it will tell you how much memory and things it has on it.
Is there like a minimum you would suggest for After Effects?
How much memory was there on the 8?
I think it's 16. So honestly, it depends on your machine. I can't really give you just a number because it depends on the machine you have. By default, it's going to go into your user area under library and caches. And if you have any of you had the problem with the scratch disk being purged in Photoshop, kind of the same thing happens here. You've got something called the disk cache, which is temporary memory. If you have an issue like I just had, something you could do is empty the disk cache. That just gets rid of all temporary files. And yeah, there's over 23 gigabytes of stuff just stored in there that I just deleted. And it's nothing I need for a current project. It's just every time I copy, every time I cut, it remembers these moves. It's called the clipboard. You also can choose where things are being saved under the media cache. But really just making sure you've enabled the disk cache and knowing that you can empty the cache if it gets too full is really helpful. Because After Effects really does take up quite a bit of time and space. Also, if you go to memory, you can increase the RAM reserved for other applications. So you can decrease this if you're worried about After Effects not getting enough. So just some different things you can do within the preferences. Going back to this, I shouldn't have any problems now. I'm on hue and saturation, and I could change the master hue, which is going to give me something pretty psychedelic, not necessarily realistic. What I would use this more is saturation. Like if you wanted to just do a basic animating from grayscale to color, just reducing the saturation is a great way of doing that. And if you can't see like the stopwatch kind of thing, we have it right up here for channel range. Otherwise, if we're interacting with effects in this panel, but once you apply an effect, if you twirl down your options, you'll see there's now an effects drop down as well. So everything in this menu is also reflected down here. Okay, so then all the effects will be listed. Right now we just have hue and saturation, and then it will give me the things that I can animate. So like if I turn on colorize, I can animate the hue. So if you want like that Old West kind of thing, this is now a Wild West landscape, just with the use of a little sepia. Or I can change the lightness of it and kind of create a watermark for behind text or something like that. But hue and saturation is a pretty handy technique. Also for color change, under Effect Color Correction, another one that I like to use is Color Balance. Color Balance gives you the midtones, the highlights, and the shadows of all three shades, R, G, and B. So if I just wanted the midtone green to be brought down, I could just do that. And that's probably even a better way of accomplishing what I did earlier with the masks, because then I can leave the blues in the sky alone and just kind of drill down a little bit more. So shadow blue, I'm going to decrease that a little bit. And it just allows me to really customize my picture more. Okay, so it just kind of depends on what kind of effect you're going for. Often I use levels and just use the different channels. You can have more than one level channel though. Like I can apply levels more than once. And usually I have the first one just doing the black and white, and then the second one will be red, green, or blue kind of thing. So color balance is a good one to use. There's tons and tons of color effect options all within this whole menu. Those are all really similar to things within Photoshop. Another one I really like is Photo Filter. This is probably going to be more interesting to you when you start doing any kind of compositing. If you're trying to bring a subject into a new background, with compositing we always want to make the subject match the coloring of the background. And Photo Filter is a nice way of adding just a tint of color to something. You could add a warming filter, a cooling filter. You've got underwater, deep yellow, things like that. You've got all these different colors, and then you can increase the density of it. So it's kind of like hue and saturation, but it's basically just adding a tint to it. And I usually do this when I'm trying to make a foreground element match a background. Let me bring in a subject. I just happen to have one. Also, every effect has a reset button to the right, so I can always reset and go back to what my options were. And if I go to project, I'm just going to double click and I'm going to bring in, I grabbed a cat ping. So we're going to put a cat on this little prairie because that's what I grabbed. So this cat is already prepared for After Effects because it's a ping. So it had the white background removed in Photoshop, and then it was saved as a ping, and that transparency was preserved in here. So this cat, first of all, it's way too big for this scene, but pretend it's the right size. It very much looks like it was just cut and paste into this. So something we could do is I could add a photo tint to the cat, just to make it match the background more. So on this cat layer, if I go Effect Photo Filter, it's the last one I use, so it's listed right there. Otherwise it's under color correction. And I want to add kind of like a green filter to this. I could turn this on and off. That helps a little bit. What's even better though is rather than guessing what color you need, if you choose custom, then it gives you access to the eyedropper. So I can say I want to match the color in this environment. And it's pretty subtle, but if I zoom in here, it might even be hard to see on the projector. This is with it applied and this is before. You see how like there's a lot more red and purple in it before? So I could turn that off or on, and I just want to increase the density a little bit more. Not so much that it's like a green cat, but I can make it so it actually looks a little more natural in that scene despite its giant panther-like size. Let's just scale him down a little. Also, this just isn't, I grabbed this off the internet, but this mask could be a little bit better. A big thing about compositing is the edge quality, just it's a lot of white here. But you can see that photo filter definitely makes it feel more natural. Another way we could use a mask in this situation is if it was walking in grass, we wouldn't see its paws so distinctly. And rather than going in with my pen tool and trying to trace the blades of grass, which would be terrible, I'm actually just going to, with the cat selected, go to my rectangular tool, and I'm going to draw a rectangle around the cat that just cuts off the very bottom of the paws. Now before you say I'm a jerk, I could turn that on and off, but remember another nice thing about masks, they have feather applied to them. So if I increase the feather on this mask, what it's going to do is just kind of soften the edge around it. And it just looks a little bit more like it's standing in the grass then, because there's that feather applied. And I can increase that if I want. I could reduce the expansion. I don't want to go too much. I could have an invisible cat. Maybe that's how he appears. You know, I got a lot of options here. But I got this little cat here. And you can just see he blends a little bit nicer with the use of that mask. So masks can be really versatile. Looks like I'm doing a children's book now. He's running away from home. Gotta add a little bindle, and he'll be fine. Let's make this story even more heart-wrenching. So there's a lot of color correction and things like that. I'm not gonna hurt the cat, don't worry, Molly. Let's make it more of a nighttime scene, talking about effects. I've already shown you a bunch of color techniques I could do to the file, but there's two ways I can affect everything, and that would be using another layer. So this is a really simplified version of a composition, but we have our background and we have our subject. Typically, I like to have foreground elements and create some depth. But if I want to create more of a nighttime scene, there's two ways I could do that. One, I could use our old friend, the solid. Solids are awesome for so many different reasons. I'm going to use a dark blue one here. And on top of everything else, it doesn't really work so great. I could use opacity and just scale that down. But that's basically what I did for that fish tank. That doesn't really quite work. I'm actually going to turn this all the way back up. And something else that you should know from Photoshop is blending modes. Okay, blending modes are just how a layer above interacts with the layer below. And even though I've been teaching this kind of stuff for 15 years, I still need to see the blending mode in action to tell you what exactly it's going to do, because it's different depending on the layer pairs. So there's so much stuff in this program that so far we've just been working with the toggle switches, which is this little grouping of them here. We want the modes. So toggle switches and modes. There's a button right here that if you click on it, it will switch to the other thing. And so modes is right here along with track matte, which we'll talk about soon. That's another masking option. And my blending mode works just like it does in Photoshop. I click on this drop down and I've got dissolve, darken, multiply, all those kinds of things. So depending on what I do, it will affect how the layers below are being affected. Now, I mentioned I've been doing this for a long time, but I still have to click through and see what it does. Instead of clicking on the drop down, one of my favorite shortcuts in any one of these Adobe programs is whenever you have blending modes, you can use Shift, plus, and minus on your keyboard to cycle through them. Plus goes up the list, minus goes down the list. So I can just do Shift minus and just cycle through these different blending modes until I see the effect that I want. And because it's the solid on top of everything, it's affecting the cat and the background. Okay? Layer order is important. If I put the solid below the cat, it's only going to affect the background. Okay? And so I can just kind of go through and see what blending mode works best for this effect. Depends on how late at night it's supposed to be. That kind of looks twilighty. I don't think twilighty is a word, but we'll pretend it is.
You have a lot of sparkly vampires.
Gross. Not in this classroom. So I think linear light works well, but it's a little too intense, so I'm just going to bring the opacity down a little bit. And it's not quite nighttime, but you get kind of this dusky feel kind of thing. There's only so much we could do with a solid color like this. So another option we have, I'm going to delete that, is if you want to affect multiple layers at once, another thing from Photoshop is an adjustment layer. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of layer types in here. There's text, there's solids. We're going to get into light and cameras and null objects soon. We've done shape layers. Adjustment layers is another layer type. And an adjustment layer is basically a clear solid. Okay, when I add it, you don't see anything, but it's there, adjustment layer 1. And just like an adjustment layer in Photoshop, an adjustment layer in After Effects affects everything below it. But I can apply any one of these effects to it. So if I go back up to color correction and to like hue and saturation again, whatever I do here affects all the layers. It's harder to tell with the cat, so I'm going to colorize it. And you can see it's doing it to both layers equally because they're both under the adjustment layer. So when you start building up things with a lot of layers, like you might be doing in your logo projects, add an adjustment layer to affect everything below it. Okay, so adjustment layers are basically just a clear layer that you can apply effects to, and everything below them will be affected.
That was layers, adjustment layer?
Mm-hmm. Any questions there? Okay. So adjustment layers are really helpful for applying those color effects and other things. For special effects, it depends on the effect you use, but I typically, actually I want to add that back in here. And I'm just going to, the nice thing about it being an adjustment layer is we also can edit it separately. So I can bring down the opacity of that. And now it just looks a little desaturated, which is what I'm going for. So my adjustment layer is affecting everything below it. There's tons and tons of effects within After Effects, not just ones that affect what's on the screen, but things that actually generate something. And for those, you typically want to add a solid. It's not always the case. It's just going to take experimentation on your part because there are so many effects in this program. But typically, we want to add a solid for some of these simulation effects. So I'm just going to go layer new solid. And I'm going to call this weather. And for this particular effect, the color does matter. It doesn't always matter, but in this one it does. And I'm going to be doing snow first, so I want a white solid. And it's a total snowstorm. My effect here is done. No, just that would be horrible. So on this weather layer, I'm going to go Effect Simulation. And there's a whole bunch of different things in here. But specifically, I'm looking for snowfall right now. So Effect Simulation Snowfall. And at first we don't see anything because it's white on white. Some effects are going to ask you if you want to composite with original. Sometimes that's awesome. In this case, I don't want it to. I just want the snow. So if I uncheck that, we actually see our snowflakes. And a lot of the things under simulation are already animated. So if I hit the space bar, we already have like the snow falling here. And the color is being determined, well actually you can determine it here. It used to be the solid color, but if I want it like raining blood, I could do that. I won't do that. I just gotta look. But I can increase the flakes. I can increase the size of the flakes. I've got variation, scene depth, speed, wind. So if I increase the wind, I'll kind of blow at an angle. Spread, wiggle. I've got all these different options I can do. And it automatically animates. So here we have this little snow storm hitting this kitten. Look at this storytelling. He ran away from home. It was bad timing. It's getting cold out. I'll generate a saucer of milk right here. Don't worry. And you can animate, remember, anything with a stopwatch next to it. So maybe I want this snowstorm to suddenly happen. I'm going to click the stopwatch for flakes at the 8-second mark. I want it to be this dense at this point. But at the beginning, I want it to be 0. So it's going to like, this is usually how it works in Wisconsin. It's just totally fine outside, and then, oh God, get the snow tires out. It's just going to start coming down. And what we can even do to amplify that effect a little bit more as it comes in, so there it is in real time, is I kind of use this adjustment layer to make it that color. Maybe we want that to happen over time. So maybe opacity-wise, it gets bleaker out. Maybe it starts a little brighter out. And then it gets bleaker as the snow starts. So we can animate all these different things to kind of sell our scene together. Question?
Can you increase the speed of snow?
Yeah, absolutely. So if I go to my weather here, if I want to increase the speed is right here. So if I up the speed, it's going to come in faster once it renders. Let me just do a RAM preview of this little area. I'm going to turn this down to half so we can actually see it. So sad. But it just kind of helps with our storytelling through the color change and by the increase of snowflakes. Like, it just kind of sets the scene a little bit more. Being in Wisconsin, we often have snow and rain at the same time. So another effect I can do in addition to snowfall is effect simulation rainfall. And poor kitten. So the rain comes down a very similar way. I'm going to turn off the snow for now. With the rain, same thing. We want to not composite on original. And the rain is very similar. It just comes straight down. We can increase the amount of drops. We can increase the size. The scene depth, I always recommend. It just makes some look further away. Speed, wind, spread. It's pretty much the same options as snow. And so, like I said, in our state, it's often both at the same time, which is so sad. There it goes. So you've got a couple of different options here with weather and things like that. This gets used a lot, both of these. Once you start using them more, you'll probably notice them being used in things, just because they're such simple ways of generating stuff. I'm going to turn rainfall back off for a second. I still have my snowfall. I'm still just on the same solid. If I go effect simulation, this one will make no sense in the situation, but I also have bubbles. And now there's bubbles coming up from the sky. It's a little bit harder to see. Let me adjust that a little bit more. Bubble amount, bubble speed. So if you want to go back to your fish aquarium projects, you can add some bubbles to those. Bubble size, wobble frequency. I'm actually going to apply these elsewhere. Let's leave this sad little kitten alone for a moment. He'll be fine. One nice thing about effects is you can copy and paste them. So I'm just going to add a solid, and when I paste, the bubble effect is on it. And so now you can see this a little bit better. So the bubble effect just once again generates stuff. It's moving up this time instead of down. There's this wiggle element applied to it. And if I go to my effect controls, I can change the bubble amount. I could change the bubble speed, the amplitude, the frequency. Oh man. The bubble size. It's a little weird. Let's maybe turn that amplitude down a little bit. There we go. And then we have reflection type too, whether it's liquid or metal, which doesn't really do a lot here. We also can choose whether the shading is inwards or outwards. So it's like backwards snow, hey. Or darken or lighten. And these are all really similar to particle effects. The nice thing about these is that it's generating them for us. Particles, we have to do all of the work. These are basically particle systems that are prepackaged and ready to go in different forms. So they all have very similar techniques, but they all kind of do different things. Another one I like a lot that's also under simulation is Drizzle. This one actually does, I want to do this actually on a picture. I'm going to bring in my Madison image here. And on this picture, I'm going to affect Drizzle. And Drizzle is actually kind of like a downward facing thing. It's kind of a cool distortion technique where it looks like ripples of water on something. Now this really only works if you're looking down at water, but later when we get into 3D, we'd be able to turn this plane flat so that if we wanted the surface of the water to be on the water, we could, kind of thing. But Drizzle's just kind of a cool technique. It's kind of warping shapes around it. That's probably enough with simulation. I'm only showing you guys a few of these because there are so many effects in this program. One last one here. Well, there's foam, which looks really horrible until you realize that it's just on a draft renderer. If I say rendered, look at those beautiful bubbles. It's so cute. And you've got producer, where it's coming from, things like that. You could choose different reflections. You also have, under simulation, starburst. And it's doing it on the Madison image, which isn't necessarily what I wanted, but that's kind of cool. Normally you would do it on a white solid in front of a black background. So this would also work for snow if you had like a car point of view and you were going like through the snow or something like that. At least that's what I picture. Warp speed stuff. If I go layer new solid, add a white solid, and affect starburst. Kind of gives you that effect like you're flying through space. This one is dependent on the solid color. If you go layer solid settings, if I was to change this to like yellow or blue or green or something, you can see it updates the effect. So it doesn't have to be for a star. You could use it for whatever you want. With this one, you could change the scatter. You could change the speed. I've actually used this graphically by making the speed 0. If you make the speed 0, it doesn't move at all. And you might ask why you would even want that, but if you've ever done anything with a sky, drawing stars sucks. It sucks bad. And so I've used this before to generate a star field. And then if I wanted to bring this into Photoshop or something like that, I would just go composition, save frame as, and I could save it as a Photoshop file. So if you want to extract just a still, you could do that at any time, but I find this particular effect really helpful for that. You won't understand if you haven't had to do stars, but drawing stars sucks. Once you get to the 12th star, you're like, oh god, why am I doing this? So this is a nice way of generating multiple stars at once, or whatever else you think this effect would be good for. Going back to just kind of distorting shapes, those were some simulation effects. Some other really fun things to play with is distortion. You've got Bezier warp. Delante, I think this is what you used for your verbs, right? So Bezier warp gives you vertexes all the way around your shape. You can kind of see the little handles here. And you could either use these or the handles to warp the shape. So if I wanted to animate all of these, I'm just going to run my cursor right down all those stopwatches. And if I move forward in time, I could just start warping this. And that will happen as time moves forward. Whoa. So Bezier warp is an option you have. It's kind of like if you want to warp things within a rectangle. It's helpful for that. I can just delete it. It's non-destructive. Also under distort, I've got bend it, bender, blobbleize, flow motion. There's just so many to show you. Blobbleize is kind of fun if you're into that kind of thing. But you can make, it almost looks like liquid or something kind of coming together. A little weird. And I could change what the light and shading is doing to it. So I could change the light intensity, the light height, the light direction. All these things will affect the way that it works. But just kind of a weird technique. I also have under distort, I like page turn is a pretty awesome one. Page turn allows you to animate a page turn animation. Just like the Bezier warp, you have this little anchor point that represents the paper, and you would just animate the fold position over time. So if I have it start over here, I'm going to click U to see my keyframes, and then around over here, I just want it to go past. This is a really great technique for like transitions and things like that. But it just is a page turn, and right now it's like clear and see-through, but you can change all that. So you can change the fold radius, you can change the light direction that's happening, you can change what the back page is. So if I want that just to be a solid, I can, or a different image. I could change the back opacity, maybe change the paper color. But I've got all these different effects that I can do, which is pretty cool. So it's just kind of a cool transition technique with page turn. I like using that one when I can. A few other ones here. Liquify, it's crazy. If you've ever used Liquify before in Photoshop, you probably know, but you know, you could go through and distort your shape over time by animating the percentages and the tools. That takes a while to render though, so I'm not going to do that just right now. We also have corner pins, something that I use quite a bit. It's more for a compositing technique, but if you wanted, instead of having this as a landscape, if you wanted this as like a poster on a wall, and you already had that hallway set, you could do corner pin, and corner pin just allows you to basically change the perspective. So it's kind of a cool effect anyways, but if I wanted to make this like a billboard, I could just kind of align this over what the perspective is and get it to line up. But corner pin is something we use a lot in motion tracking. It's very rare that if you're shooting a screen, you almost never shoot a TV screen, computer screen, or phone screen. The frequency is different than what you film at. You get this banding and flicker. Typically you shoot something with nothing on it, and then use corner replacement to match it up where it should be using motion tracking. We're going to be talking about that near the end of the semester. But corner pin's pretty effective and fun when you need it. So many different effects in here. Spherize. If you want to create kind of like a magnification technique, you can, and then you can kind of move this around. Like, oh, hey. I think somebody did this on their verb. I don't remember who it was. Somebody did the word magnify and use this effect. But really, my best advice is to just play with stuff. There's just so many things you can do here. Here's twirl. You know, if you want just like a funky background or something, we could twirl that or change the radius. It's kind of cool. Tons and tons of options under distort. There's also different perspective options. So I did spherize, but if I went effect perspective sphere, I would actually wrap this around a sphere. This is a way of doing really low level 3D within After Effects. I could actually animate the rotation of this along X, Y, or Z. So if I wanted to create like a little Madison globe, I could. What's cool is it has like full 3D capabilities. So I can change where the lighting's coming from. I can change how intense the shading or lighting is, whether it's metal or not, how reflective it is. You've got all these different options that you can kind of control. I've used this for like planets before, which is actually what we'll do in an exercise in a few weeks. I could change the lighting of the light here, color of the lighting, but lots and lots of different ways I can kind of affect the shape. Another cool way to use sphere that a lot of people don't think about is using it with text. And there's two ways I could go about doing this. I'm going to turn this off, and I'm just going to use my text tool to write around the world, which is in white right now. Oh god, it's still giddy up. What a horrible surprise. Let's do Helvetica instead, shall we? And let's just kind of squish this together. Now, it's important to be mindful of your bounding box and what it's around. This is kind of an interesting example. So if I want this to be spherized, I could still go affect CC sphere, but the readability kind of sucks because it's only as big as the text. So the text is reaching the top and bottom of the sphere, and that makes it really difficult to really see what's even going on. It's kind of a cool effect. It's see-through, but the readability kind of falls apart. So instead, what we would do is create a pre-comp. Okay, you've already done pre-comps as a way of turning in your verb exercise. Basically what I would do, I'm going to get rid of Madison here, is I want the white salad behind around the world to fuse together. There's no way to group in After Effects. You either pre-compose or you use a parent-child relationship, which we'll get to later. I want to pre-compose these two together. I have two ways I could do that. Before, you dragged a composition into another composition. So right now this is comp 4. I'm going to rename this Around the World, ATW. It's technically already a pre-composition. Oh no, this is comp 3. I don't know what comp 4 is. Let's get rid of that. When I click on them, there's a little thumbnail right here. So I want this to be Around the World. I'm just going to call this Zaround. Oh my god. So it's already pre-composed in a way. If I created a new composition, I could simply drag this one down into it. You could see the bounding box is the size of both things together. So now when I go affect sphere, it's a little more readable, okay? Because it's the white as well as the text. And now I could animate along and you would see the text moving. Okay, so it's a little bit different. The other way you could do that is just within the comp, around this thing. This is already pre-composed, but you can pre-compose within a composition as well. If you select more than one layer, you could right-click and choose pre-compose, and that will do it right within the composition you're working on. You don't need to nest anything or bring it in. And then I could add sphere and do the same thing here. So there's a couple of different options that I could change the radius and animate the rotation. Question?
Could you make the background transparent now, or would you have to have a color?
That's a really good question. So remember, when you're working with a pre-comp, to edit the original comp, you just have to double click to go into it. So if I double clicked on this comp, I'd go into the original, and I would just have to turn this off. And I go back into here. I still have the benefit of its scale, but I don't actually need it anymore. And then I could just animate the rotation, and I would have just the text going around. And maybe I'd want to rotate this a little bit so we could actually see the text so it doesn't pass around itself or something. So it's kind of cool though. It's kind of a cool way of faking a more complex 3D system. We're going to get to 3D, but Sphere is pretty fun. In addition to Sphere, poor cat. In addition to Sphere, you also have Cylinder, which works very much the same way. If you go Effect, Distort, wait, which one was I on actually? I don't even remember. Generate. I'm having a total brain fart, which is why this exists. I'm going to type in Cylinder, and I'm going to be like, oh yeah, it's right there. It's under perspective, of course. But Cylinder, same kind of thing. It just wraps it around the shape. And if we were to rotate this, you could see that, but if I rotate it, we can actually see in that tube. So lots of weird things we can do in here. This is, if anyone's working on a plumbing logo, I got you. I got you right here. So Cylinder is helpful for that. Other ones under perspective, I'm just deleting these effects. There's Drop Shadow, which I believe we talked about before, which is good for text. There's bevel edges, but I really don't like beveling so much in this program. Transitions we're going to get into. There's so many more things we're going to cover in the upcoming weeks. I just wanted to give you some of the ones I consider to be a little more common. Blurs, I suppose, are actually a pretty good thing to know as well. There's a lot of different kinds of blurs. but blurs can be used as a way of doing like an entrance or exit. So you've got blurriness, and you could blur something to the point where you just don't even really see it anymore. I find this even more effective for text. So if I had just the word Madison, and that looks so hideous, but that's okay. Let's at least go bold here. But if I apply an effect, a blur to text, it's actually kind of a cool way of hiding it. You know, if I had wanted this to disappear, I can make the blurriness change over time to the point of where we don't even really see the text anymore. I gotta push it quite a bit here. I'm just kind of reloading my mouse each time. I could just guess and type in a really high number, but then over time I would get just kind of a disintegration technique. So you can use blur for just about anything, but it's just kind of a cool way to bring text in or out. And if I click U, I could just flip-flop these keyframes if I wanted this to be an entrance instead. So then it would come from nothing and kind of come together to form the word. So blurs can be pretty helpful depending on the different effects you're trying to do. There's really no shortage of things we can do to modify our text in this program. So just a couple of different effects we can do within our After Effects composition. One last example, we're not going to talk about character animation for quite a while yet. That's like our third project. We're in our first project right now. But just because I thought it might be useful to some of you, I wanted to really quickly demonstrate the puppet tool, which is actually why I found the cat. The puppet tool is not an effect. It's a tool within After Effects right along the top here. It's the last tool. It looks like a little push pin. And I'm going to turn my snow layer off for a moment. This push pin allows us to place points on something. And we could do this to text or an image, but if we do it to an image, we want to make sure there's transparency around it. Okay, otherwise we're just animating a big square. And the puppet pin tool, you basically click to place pins. So if I want the cat's tail to flick, I want to place pins along its tail. It doesn't hurt the animal, don't worry. And not only do I need to place the pins where I want movement to occur, I also need to place it where I want the thing to be anchored. Okay, so these are, if you've ever made like a paper doll in grade school or beyond, where they have the little rivets where the thing's attached, that's basically what the puppet pin's doing. So I want to pin anywhere else just to make sure it stays put. I'm going to pin the nose. And just by doing that, now you could see that that's staying stationary, but now the feet are moving. So I just want to pin each foot too. And then finally I should be able to move that back. So you kind of had that's a little better. We got some ear movement. So you just kind of have to figure out what's best as far as how many pins you want. And like Snow and Rain, this is already set to be animated. If I clicked U right now, you'd see we have puppet, mesh, and then there's 10 puppet pins right now that all have a keyframe ready to go. So to animate this, I would just move forward in time and move the position of one of the pins, or multiple pins. And maybe I move that back this way now and drop this down a little. And then that's just going to create movement on that shape. He's like, oh god, it's snowing. But I can move this little back leg, maybe this front leg, and just create really subtle motion. This is not necessarily something you would use for character animation. It's not that sophisticated, but it's a good way of adding some motion to something. And so now if we turn these other layers back on, those pins don't animate, but then they'll be like, oh god, what's going on? I can make him shivering a little bit. I could add wiggle to this. So the puppet pin's a really great tool. Like I said, we're going to go much deeper into it in the future. Something to be aware of is when you're animating text, you can actually add text. You can add the puppet pin to text as well, but it only connects things that are touching. So if I click on the A and add a pin, I could actually puppet pin the A, but it doesn't do the rest of the letters. Okay, so I'd have to go through and do those separately. The only way to get the whole word to behave is if you actually brought like the tracking together, so it was all touching, which obviously isn't going to work for every word. And now if I use the puppet pin, it will actually do it for the whole thing. And then I could animate my text wiggling around and stuff too. So it just depends on what you want to do. If you want to do individual letters, don't have them touch. Otherwise, I can make this whole thing move. So you certainly don't need to use the puppet pin right now. I just saw some people's logos that I thought maybe they'd want just a little specialized movement in there. Normally, as you know, we need to have a separate layer to animate. So before the puppet pin tool, I would have to have this tail be a separate layer in each leg, and I still do that sometimes. But this is just a fun tool to kind of play with and add just a little bit of motion to your file. And now we have our sad little cat story. And he's just like, why? Those pins are highlighting just because I have that layer highlighted. And then if I find a movement I like the tail movement here, I could just copy and paste it. And he would just continue flicking his tail over time there. So a couple of different options there. By the way, you don't use the puppet pin to move an object, just parts of an object. So if I wanted the cat to move left to right, I would still animate position. I wouldn't do that with the puppet pin. So maybe we want him in this spot right here, but then further back, we have him kind of coming from this way, and he's going to slide Gumby style. So if we want to add like a little up and down movement here, we could. Not that that's really going to help. Now he's just sliding on an uneven surface. But you get the idea. And we can just do things to kind of enhance our work. Next time I'll show you how to add a little hat. No. So he's not cool. There's a filter for that, I swear.